Welcome to another wonderful Susanna Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susanna Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Temporary Sheriff. Chapter 1. It was the end of July, the turning point of another long, hot summer in crowded New York City. And, Alma Weaver hoped devoutly, the turning point of her young life, as well. Steeling herself, she lifted one fist and knocked at the door, even as she put her other hand over her middle, protectively, trying desperately to force her nerves to calm themselves. It wasn't as though she'd never had such an interview before. Goodness only knew how many there had been over the past few years. But this time, well, it felt different. This time, she needed it. Times were hard in New York. They always had been for as long as Alma could recall, even when she was young, living with her older brother and his wife, she had had to work at whatever she could. When Tom and Adelaide decided to remove themselves to Canada to follow the newest line of the Transcontinental Railroad, Alma had been left behind to fend for herself. The piecework and mending she had been handling up until then was far from enough to pay the rent, let alone put food in the cupboard. It was then, when she was scarcely 16 years old, that she began to take on work as a governess. She had always done well at it. She loved children. Someday, she hoped, she would have some of her own. But that was little more than a far-off fantasy now. It wasn't as though fellows were falling all over themselves to court an impoverished woman of 25 years old, with little family to her name and no real friends to speak of. She was too hard-working to have time to socialize with anyone other than the children she was in charge of. She was an excellent governess, and her children had always adored her. Unfortunately, the same was not always true of the parents. She winced at the thought of her most recent employer. Jacob Herring had seemed nice enough 2 years before when Alma had applied to become the governess to his 3 wards. But scarcely a month had gone by before she realized that there was something off about him. A parade of women of all ages came and went from the house, with little or no explanation, and worse, many of them seemed only to come at night and leave the next morning. Alma was innocent in the ways of the world, but she knew what that meant. Jacob was the sort of man her sister-in-law had warned her about. But everything had been pleasant, for a time, until Jacob seemed to notice one day that the young governess in his employ, innocent and naive, was rather nice to look at. Even more dangerous for Alma, he found out that she had no protector, no one, that is, but herself. The door opened at last, and Alma shook herself free of the memory, pushing it far away. Instead, she mustered her brightest, most demure smile. "Hello, I'm here to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Alcott, regarding the position of governess." The maid nodded without speaking and conducted Alma through the hallway of the grand house. Grand, Alma thought, was a bit of an understatement. She'd been in big houses before, but nothing quite like this. It was richly appointed, with every surface housing some knick-knack that was undoubtedly worth more than a year's worth of her wages. If she was hired on here as she hoped to be, she would spend the next few years in dread of accidentally brushing up against a shelf. "Mr. Alcott, Mrs. Alcott, a young lady to see you about the children." Thus introduced, Alma was shown to the chair across the desk from the stern-faced man of middle age who, she assumed, must be Mr. Andrew Alcott. His wife stood a few feet away, facing the window, her arms crossed. She turned and laid her pale-colored eyes on Alma with a look that was at once calculating and disinterested. Mr. Alcott, for his part, frowned a bit deeper as he looked up from the papers on his desk, but his eyes lingered on Alma, and after a moment some slight warmth appeared in them at last. He said. Alma clutched tightly to her handbag with both hands, grateful that her gloves would keep her white knuckles from showing. But could they tell by some other telltale sign how very nervous she was? Oh, she mustn't let on, she knew, she couldn't let it slip how dependent she was on this position. Why, if she didn't get this job, then she would have to leave New York. And would that be such a terrible thing? Her mind whispered. She had no more time for reflection. You are the fourth governess we've interviewed thus far this morning, Mrs. Alcott said abruptly. Why, pray tell, should we consider you to care for our precious John and Eliza? Alma gulped. I suppose the best reason, she said, is that I adore children, and because I adore them, I know how important it is that they be raised to be good, kind, respectable men and women. I am neither indulgent nor overly strict, and I believe the parent has every right to determine the path the young ones will take until such a time as they are old enough to decide for themselves. Mr. Alcott gave a short bark of a laugh, glancing back at his wife. Alma was certain now that there was a warm spark in his eyes. There you are, Susie. That's as fine an answer as you could have hoped for. Why, she's a veritable mixture of old-fashioned and newfangled, and all wrapped up in a pretty package, too. How old are you, Miss Weaver? Alma supplied, grateful for his apparent support. Miss Weaver. I suppose I shouldn't ask that question. It's the height of rudeness, they say. You have every right to ask me any question you like. I am 25 years old. The corners of his mouth turned up in something like a smile, and he glanced back at his wife once more. She stepped forward a few feet, but she did not smile. I suppose that's a decent age, she said, begrudgingly. Not too young, and yet young enough to keep up with our energetic little ones. She frowned anew, tapping her lips with a fingertip. Weaver, it seems as though I've heard the name recently. Alma kept quiet, unsure of what to say, but Andrew Alcott stepped in carelessly. It's a common enough name, Sue. It was in the paper for some advertisement or other, I dare say. His wife's brows drew downward at his flippant explanation, but he had refocused his attention on Alma once more, carrying on. You have references, of course? She bit her lip, taking a deep breath and hoping that this moment, of all moments, would pass smoothly, without undue questioning. Nodding, she handed over the paper with the list of homes she had worked at over the past several years. Most of them were excellent references, should the Alcotts choose to inquire. Only one, she knew, would speak in something other than glowing terms. Alcott read through the list, nodding, clearly careless. His wife came to read over his shoulder. After a moment she gave a little cry of triumph and snatched the paper. Jake, she said. Dear Jake, Andrew, you see, I knew that I'd heard the name Weaver somewhere recently. She lifted her chin proudly, gazing down at Alma as though she was something she'd found under her shoe. Were you not dismissed without ceremony from the Herring household? Alma's nerves were wound so tightly that her stomach seized up in cramps. She knew now that there was no going back, this was a position that would go to someone else. Dear Jake, the Alcotts must know Jacob Herring and know him well. What must he have said about her? Anxiety and nerves twisted up along with anger at the injustice, the unfairness of it all. And yet, she managed to keep her voice calm as she replied, as though someone else were speaking for her. My employment there came to rather an abrupt end, she allowed, but I was not forced to leave. I dismissed myself, and I was not told that he would give no reference. She had only hoped that none would be asked for. And why is that, pray tell? Jake Herring is a dear friend of ours, and we understand that he is an excellent employer. Why, his butler has been in his employ for well over 20 years. Why should you choose to leave such a position? She gulped past the lump in her throat. I'm afraid I cannot answer that. Come now, said Andrew Alcott, as though a little reasoning would change Alma's mind. If there's some reason why you left, you can't expect a respectable family to simply take your word over that of a man we've known for years. Alma pressed her lips together, dropping her eyes to the desk. Of course not, she murmured. And yet, I cannot tell you, all the same. I know why, said Susan Alcott, her pale eyes narrowed into points of light. She thought more of herself than she ought to, Andrew. She got ideas about her position in the house, her relationship with Jake. There's no point to denying it, Miss Weaver, for Jake told us himself. For shame. Oh, murmured her husband, his brow clearing as he understood what his wife was insinuating. He glanced again at Alma, and she was dismayed to see that this time, there was disgust in his expression. Again, the injustice of it curled inside her mouth, demanding to be let out. Not 10 seconds ago he had been admiring her himself, and now to hear that someone else might have done so, and to blame her for it. To blame her for that awful moment that still replayed in her worst dreams, when her employer had pulled her aside late one evening after she put the children to bed and entrapped her unwillingly in his embrace. No one else had been around. She had been painfully aware that if she had screamed, no one would have heard. It was only through sheer luck that the housekeeper returned to collect something she had forgotten. The sound of the door opening below them had startled Jacob Herring just long enough for Alma to make her escape. The next morning, red-faced, she had done her best to carry out her responsibilities while avoiding him all the while, and yet, when he came upon her that evening, a glint in his eye, she knew that it was only a matter of time. He had made no threats, but she did not need to hear them to understand that to accuse a wealthy, well-respected man of making unwelcome overtures would be the end of her employment in New York. And now, without having accused him of anything, the outcome was just the same. Jacob Herring bore a grudge, it seemed, and he was out to ruin her for rejecting him as she had done, or to force her to return to him for employment, something she had sworn to herself that she would never do. The cold-eyed triumph of Susan Alcott, the thinly concealed and hypocritical contempt of her husband, was too much for Alma to bear. She stood from her chair, gripping her handbag even more tightly as though it were the only thing standing between herself and oblivion. I feel that nothing more can be said. Only that I pledge my innocence in any wrongdoing, Mr. and Mrs. Alcott, and I would have done my best for your children. Well, you won't have a chance to do your best, or your worst, either, Susan Alcott said acidly. Alma bit back an angry response and merely inclined her head. Good day, she said, and found her way blindly to the door. Somehow, she was back out on the street outside the house. Grateful for the heat of the sun, disguising the flush on her cheeks, she lifted her head and marched away from the Alcott residence. She would continue on until they could no longer see her, until she was out of sight and out of mind, until the embarrassment and shame of the interview she had just undergone was far, far in her past. And then what? She felt a surge of despair. She had been out of work for 6 months now, ever since she had walked away from Jacob Herring's house. She had applied to dozens of households in that time and attended a handful of interviews. Each time, another had been chosen. Surely, they could not all have been Jacob Herring's doing, but now, with this last hope slipping from her grasp, she realized that it didn't matter in the least who was behind it. If she did not return home to her little rented flat with employment of some kind, she might as well pack her bags and go to sleep on the street this very night. She had less than a week left on her rent, and she could not stand the thought of asking her landlord for an extension of time. She'd been overdue often enough as it was. Times were hard in New York. Was there anywhere, she wondered bitterly, where they were not hard? And if so, how on earth could she find a way there? Chapter 2. Alma was not at all certain whether the matrimonial agency's match was an answer from the heavens, or simply a matter of her own faulty, imperfect self, grasping desperately at the only option she had left. And, she thought uncomfortably as the train racketted southwest, she might well never know one way or the other. Certainly, the match had come about quickly. She still could hardly believe it. One day she had been in utter despair, facing a close-hovering winter on the unfriendly streets of New York, and then the next, she was seated on a thinly cushioned third-class seat in the austere compartment, wondering blindly at the turn her life had taken. She had to put her mind to it to recall exactly what had happened. The Alcotts had been her last chance at finding work in the city. With that final opportunity gone for good, she'd taken a leap of faith and applied at the matrimonial agency near her neighborhood, half expecting that nothing would come of it at all. But something did come of it. Her gaze drifted downwards, away from the window of the speeding train, to fall once more on the letter held tightly in her grasp. His name was William Allen, and he was 35, 10 years older than Alma herself. He was a widower, she knew that much, though the letter touched only briefly on that point without offering any explanation of the circumstances. He ran a ranch on the outskirts of Roebuck, Texas, which he had inherited from his father upon the older man's death. His mother Martha lived in a cottage on the property. What had he done before ranching? Alma wondered. What did being a rancher's wife entail? She knew little about Texas, or anywhere other than New York, for that matter. Surely the landscape and the people would be different. Would she fit in, or would she stand out forever as belonging elsewhere? What chance did she have of happiness with this man she had never met? She thoughtfully smoothed her fingertips over the letter. It was straightforward, if rather short. It allowed for little sense of the man who had written it apart from her supposition that he was an honest and hard-working man with little family to his name. What had incited him to write to the matrimonial agency back east? Perhaps he was lonely, having lost his wife. Or perhaps, like me, he is desperate. She took a deep breath. The train was slowing. The next stage of the journey, she knew, would be accomplished by stagecoach, a much more daunting prospect than the relative speed and ease of the train. It would be another week at least before she arrived in Roebuck, Texas, and as the autumn had come upon them suddenly halfway through her trip, she feared aberrant weather that might delay them even further. She'd never much enjoyed the cold, even when she had a nice warm coal fire to sit beside. On the coach, she would have no chance of getting warm. And perhaps even less, once I'm in Texas and have nowhere else to go. But there was no point in dwelling overmuch on the possibilities that lay ahead. Perhaps it would prove to be that her match with Mr. William Allen would be the guidance of the Heavenly Father, and everything would turn out for the best. Either way, she had done what she must, and that must be her primary comfort. With determination, she prepared herself for the second half of the journey southwest. But the stagecoach put her determination to the test almost immediately. It was not cold, no, with that frequent and unpredictable changeability that so often comes along with the turning of the seasons. A suffocating heat suddenly blanketed the area as they drove through. The wheels of the stage turned endlessly, day after day. Stuffed into the carriage, sharing a seat with 5 others, Alma could scarcely draw breath. It was with relief that she discovered, on the 3rd day, that one of the seats on the roof of the carriage were vacated. That day was markedly pleasant, especially in counterpoint to the rest of the journey. She was thrilled to ride in the fresh air, even though it was just as blazing hot there with no shelter from the sun. At least she was not hemmed in and pressed in upon on all sides. And the landscape that rolled, or rather, jolted, by was every bit as unique and different as she had expected it to be. It was almost uncanny to realize that, for long stretches of the road, she could not see a single building at all. The difference between the city where she had been born and raised, full of crowded streets and bustling people, and this wide, flat, endlessly reaching land was a stark contrast. How peculiar, she thought, that she could feel so utterly alone in the city, and yet so strangely among friends here in this vast, unknown wilderness, with only her fellow travelers on the stagecoach for company. She hoped that the feeling would last. On the 4th day, with only a few hundred miles left of the journey, the weather took a sudden turn. Perched on the roof of the coach, she could see it coming clearly. Behind her the heat continued, shimmering in waves, rising from the road they had traveled. Ahead, though, storm clouds were headed toward them, with streaks of lightning visible every so often even from this distance. The middle-aged man seated next to Alma on the roofed sked as he shook his head and turned to her. "You'd better hold on tight, miss," he advised her. "That storm looks as though it means business." A sudden gust of wind, driving the clouds ever closer, nearly whisked her hat away. She clasped it onto her head with one hand and took a firmer grip on the edge of her seat with the other. "Is it dangerous?" He chuckled a little. "Not unless you're made of spun sugar and likely to melt in the rain." Despite his light-hearted words, though, she could sense an underlying tension and knew that it was, indeed, potentially dangerous, no matter what he said. New York had its snowstorms, its rain, but she had never seen clouds quite as dark as these, and there was a strange metallic taste to the wind as it picked up once more. The stagecoach rolled on. She glanced down to the driver to see that his neck was craned up. He, too, was watching the sky, and whipped the horses into a faster pace as he did so. "Looks like we're in for it, folks," he barked over his shoulder. "Any room for the little miss inside there?" Alma was reluctant to clamber back down inside the coach, but the idea of going through the thunder and lightning and rain without any shelter apart from her hat was not appealing. By the time she made it, a light patter of drops had started, and the wind was strangely chilly. Her murmur of thanks was lost in a mighty crack of thunder. Her rooftop companion came sliding in after her with a whoop. Here it comes, boys. It was more crowded than ever in the coach, and the wind was strong enough to rock the enclosure on its wheels unsteadily. Still the horses went on, and the rain was pelting down now, hammering on the roof in a way that made Alma even more grateful to be inside, crushed between two other travelers as she was. Her friend from the roof reached up to pound on the front panel. "Hey out there, Bill. You'd better stop and come in." A flash of lightning and a crash of thunder obscured the first part of Bill's response. "Miles to go yet, Harry. The horses'll keep up the pace if I let them. Won't do nobody any good if you get swept off your seat and into the fields." "Ah, I'd find my way back again, never you worry," called the driver back with a jovial laugh. "I've got my little flask tucked right under me, and I couldn't leave that behind." A chuckle ran through the crowded coach, but there was an undertone of unease. The lightning came so quick and close and furious that Alma felt the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. This storm was unlike anything she'd ever seen, unlike anything she'd ever imagined. If this was what the weather was like in Texas, perhaps she should have stayed in New York and risked the winter on the streets. The rain had turned to hail, so loud that it drowned out any other hope of noise or speech, churning up the landscape. As she watched, it thickened so drastically that it whited out what little she could see through the window. A shout from the driver sounded far away and vague, but she was certain that it was a sound of distress. Almost simultaneously, the wagon gave a great creak and then a crack, the wheel closest to Alma settling with a jolt and the entire structure leaning alarmingly. The crowd in the coach gave vent to cries and screams of distress and fright as they tried to scramble back toward the opposite side and right the stage, but there was no organization to the movement and an elderly woman gave a heartbreaking cry of pain. "Stop, stop." Alma found herself yelling, reaching to ward off the young man nearest to the old woman. "You're hurting her." She turned to the man who had been beside her on the rooftop, her mind spinning wildly. "Can you open the door? Below us, the door on the downside." He frowned. "And risk us all spillin' out. Just a few of us. We must get out and push the coach back up. If it goes all the way over, someone might be killed." A split second passed while he considered the truth of this, and then he nodded. Rather than reach for the door, he levered the window down with a grunt of effort and slid himself through to the outside. Alma glanced around swiftly and tugged on the sleeve of the young man who had nearly trampled the old lady. "Outside. Follow him." Taken aback by her tone, the young man did as he was told without asking any questions. Alma held her breath and followed suit, dropping over the side of the coach through the window into the mud. The wind outside was tremendous, with nothing to break its force. The driver came tumbling over the side toward them, half intentionally and half blown by the gale, and stood panting close to their little knot. "Wheels sunk," he howled above the wind. "We've got to push it back or the whole thing will go over." Without waiting for the rest to acknowledge it, he turned and threw himself against the side of the coach. The other two men followed suit, but the structure hardly budged, buffeted by the wind. Biting her lip, Alma put her whole weight against the coach, knowing that it wouldn't help any more than if she had touched it with her fingertip. The driver was nearest to her. He turned his head to see her, and she caught a glimpse of his frown through the driving rain. Half expecting him to order her out of the way, it was startling to hear him call, "Go to the horses." The horses. Grab M by the reins, pull M to the right. She held her breath and jolted herself into movement, knowing that if she waited even for a second her courage might fail her. It nearly failed as she rounded the front of the carriage and found herself confronted with the four huge, lunging, snorting beasts. Her experience with animals was limited in the extreme, and the way they were now, rearing in the traces and screaming with distress and fright, might have been enough to quell the most determined heart. But a flash of lightning illuminated the swinging reins, shaken free of their hook on the driver's box, and she darted forwards to capture them. Holding them tightly fisted, she backed up as far as she could, leaning her small weight against the creatures to urge them toward the middle of the road. Her auburn hair had long before come loose from its pins, plastered to her face by the rain so that she could scarcely see through it, but she did not dare loosen her two-handed hold on the leather reins long enough to brush it aside. Half blind in the raging storm, she urged and coaxed the horses to follow her. With their strength assisting the three men, the carriage wheel broke loose from the sodden rut and the carriage thumped upright with a wild swing, jolting forward from the momentum of the horses. "Whoa!" she heard the driver shout, and she echoed the cry frantically. "Whoa!" The horses, miraculously, stopped and stood, heads down against the driving rain. In a moment the driver was at her side again, breathing hard, and took the reins from her cold, numbed grasp. He gave her a nod. "Back inside, miss. I'll see to M." She didn't realize how frozen she was until she was back in the relative warmth and safety of the coach. The other two men had already clambered back in and were busily answering the myriad questions from the rest of the travelers. Upon seeing her, they broke off and welcomed her in with open arms. "Let the little miss take a seat, there. She's been awfully brave. Come here by me, miss, and have a sip of my flask, that'll warm you up." The warmth of the whiskey slid down her throat and flooded her whole body with a slight glow. She clasped her shaking hands together, and it was only then that the enormity of what she had done, what she had helped to do, overcame her. Her rooftop companion gave her a nudge and a smile that was as warm as his whiskey. "Might have all ended in tragedy, 'cept for you, little miss," he said. "It was God who set you on the path that put you here today, I'm sure of it." Alma could not help but wonder. Was it truly the act of a wise and far-seeing Lord who had enabled her to help the travelers? Was that a sign that her choice to engage herself to a stranger in a strange land was the right one? Or was the near tragedy of the coach, the gut-wrenching force and violence of the storm, not in itself a sign that the decision she had made was the wrong one, with only more tragedy to follow? She did not know. She knew that she could not know, not for certain. Not until she reached Texas and met the man she was to marry, and walked into her future with her eyes open and watchful. Chapter 3. The storm abated almost as suddenly as it had arrived. It was the morning of the last day of the journey, and the sun was out, shining bravely as though it had never feared defeat. The little band of travelers that pulled at last to a stop in Roebuck, Texas, was ragged and exhausted but cheerful, nonetheless. Why should they not be? Alma thought with a rueful smile. After all, they had avoided any true tragedy, by strength of will and willingness to work together. Now that some time had passed, her acute sense of how close they had come to a fatal accident had dulled somewhat. It would be a story to tell her children, that was certain, but she did not fear nightmares. She had come through the ordeal just as strong as she had gone into it, perhaps even stronger. Alma was the only traveler who was disembarking at the little town of Roebuck. The rest were going on to larger towns in Texas, like Fort Worth, or even further west, all the way to California. She found herself unexpectedly emotional at making her farewells to the rest of the sojourners. The kindly smile and heartfelt thanks of the driver brought tears to her eyes. While she waited for the porter to retrieve her valise from the rooftop, where it had no doubt been completely soaked by the rain, she went to say goodbye to the horses, smoothing her fingertips cautiously down their velvet noses. "Farewell," she whispered to them. "And, thank you." The journey was over, and with it, what she hoped would be quite the most exciting part of her life. She wasn't at all certain that she could handle any more excitement than that. As she stepped around the stagecoach to face forward, she took a deep breath and squared her shoulders, lifting her chin and looking heavenward to the autumn sunlight. As her eyes fell once more toward earth, she caught sight of the man who was watching her. He stood at the corner of the little inn where the stagecoach stopped, leaning against the wall. His hands were buried in his pockets, as though he were simply biding his time, but his eyes were keenly fixed on her as though he had been awaiting her arrival. A little frisson ran through her at the force of his gaze. His eyes, she could tell even from this distance, were blue, a deep, yet somehow translucent, blue, as though she were looking into the depths of an inland lake. Was he handsome? She could not be entirely certain of what she thought of him. But he was striking, that much was beyond doubt. His features were rather narrow, and sharply angled black eyebrows gave him something of the look of a devil. But there was humor in the curve of that mouth, she thought, even if she could not see it echoed in his eyes. He pushed away from the wall and came toward her. "Miss Weaver." So much certainty in that voice, as though there was no one else she could possibly be. Had the matrimonial agency described her so accurately? Or was it merely the fact that no one else had disembarked from the stagecoach here in Roebuck? She heard the slight shakiness in her voice as she replied. I am. Are you Mr. William Allen? A half smile and a nod. I am. They stood and regarded each other for a moment. She took a deep breath and managed a smile, but he did not respond in kind, only giving her an even more scrutinizing stare. At last, he put out a hand for her to shake. Welcome to Roebuck. I expected you earlier today. Oh, she took his hand, finding it to be strong and calloused and warm, but he dropped her grasp almost immediately, with nothing more than the most perfunctory of touches. We encountered a storm along the way, and it set us back by several hours. Yes, he said, nodding, there are often storms this time of year. She waited for him to ask further questions, or to express his alarm, to tell her that he was glad she was all right, but he said none of the expected words, instead turning and gesturing in front of him. I'll take your bag for you. Right this way, Miss Weaver, the cart's just around the corner. Feeling somewhat bemused, and, she had to admit to herself, more than a little disappointed, she followed him. He hefted her bag into the back of the little farm cart as though it weighed no more than a feather, then held out a hand to help her up into the driver's box. Once more, she noted the warmth and strength of his grasp, but it lingered no longer this time than it had the last, and then he was up beside her, reins wrapped casually around one hand, giving the horses a whistle that started them moving forward. The preacher will be waiting, he said. Alma felt her stomach drop, her fingertips growing cold. The preacher, she repeated. He glanced at her, looking puzzled. Of course. I figured we ought to marry as soon as you arrived. A small town like this, rumors spread faster than wildfire. Oh, she said softly. I thought with your mother living with you. She's in the cottage, just behind the ranch house. Not close enough to save anyone's reputation, I'm afraid. He frowned a bit deeper, leaning closer to her. Is that all right, Miss Weaver? What could she say? She had half expected that her marriage would happen soon after her arrival, and yet, here she was still covered in dried mud, exhausted, uncertain, hungry, and the idea of going and getting married immediately made her feel like leaping from the cart and running the other way. It seemed impossible that she should wish to be back in the relative safety of the stagecoach. William Allen was still watching her, scrutinizing her face, but she turned her head away, unwilling to let him read her reluctance. Of course, she said. We cannot risk anyone's reputation. It's true, he said slowly. I figured, I reckoned it would be clear enough that we ought to marry right away, though I guess I didn't say as much. And that was true, too. His letter had not expressed his intention to marry as soon as she stepped off the stage, but neither had she really expected anything different. She was here as a mail-order bride, after all. What else should she hope for? It's all right, she said, still with her head turned away. It's only that, I'm just tired, I suppose. Of course you are, he said at once, and she thought she heard relief in his voice. We'll just have the preacher marry us right quick, and then I'll take you out to the ranch and you can have a bath and something to eat and a nice rest. My ma will have supper ready and waiting. You'll like her, everyone does. Alma couldn't help but wish that his mother had chosen to accompany him to meet her. A comforting female presence would have been very welcome in the moment. But perhaps he had not invited his mother to do so. Was she to marry without any friendly face to bear witness? The little church was on the far side of town. Still, with Roebuck being as small as it wasn't more than a few minutes before they arrived. William Allen swung down from the seat and helped her down in his wake. This time, his hand lingered on hers, and he stood quite close, looking down at her. She risked a glance up to meet his gaze and found that his eyes were full of an unexpected kindness. It's not ideal, he said. It's not perfect, rushing into things like this. But I promise it'll get better after this, Miss Weaver. She heard the conviction in his voice. It made her feel strangely desperate to believe him, to believe that life would smooth out and run forward with joy and peace and love, that the harshness and difficulties of the life she had left behind in New York would be repaid with a future that was beyond even her dreams. After all, he continued, everything will look brighter in the morning. He sounded as though he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Her heart sank again. This was no promise of utter happiness in their lives together. He was only reminding her that the exhaustion of travel was temporary, and that perhaps tomorrow she would feel a bit better. Desultorily, she took his offered hand and allowed him to lead her into the small church. The ceremony was a brief, bright whirl through the depths of her tired mind. Few details were able to penetrate long enough to be remembered with any clarity. There were, in fact, a few friendly faces there to bear witness. She was introduced to them, but didn't recall their names. The preacher was a heavy-set, middle-aged man with a beaming smile who welcomed her down the aisle with little ceremony and even less pomp and circumstance. Amid her own confusion, she heard her voice repeating the vows in a murmur, promising to love, honor, and obey, and she knew that William Allen, too, must be saying his vows as he was instructed. But she could get no sense of him apart from the way his eyes felt, fixed on her with such intensity, as though he was half afraid she would disappear if he looked away even for a second. The only phrase that she heard with any certainty was the last. I now pronounce you man and wife. Alma Weaver was no more. There was only Alma Allen, now. William Allen, her husband, took her hand and held it briefly but tightly. She wondered if he meant it as a comfort. She wondered, if so, whether it was intended to be a comfort to her or to himself. Suddenly it occurred to her to wonder why this man, with his appearance so striking and his good reputation as a hard worker, had chosen to marry someone from far away rather than finding a bride closer. Had he no hopes of finding love there in Roebuck? Even worse, the thought that he had no real hope of finding love at all, and this marriage was nothing more than a convenience, to alleviate the need of finding a housekeeper to cook and clean for him. Her suspicions now awakened, she found them not in the least bit denied by the silence that he held all the way to the ranch house. He seemed to be plunged deep into his own thoughts. She herself could not find the strength to make conversation and had little inclination to do so to begin with. Oh, if only this day would end. She longed to crawl between the covers and lose herself to the world. But she was a married woman now. Suppose he expected her to pull herself together and prepare supper for him that very evening, as exhausted as she was? She had forgotten about his promise of his mother's thoughtfulness. The older woman was waiting for them on the veranda when they arrived. There you are. I'd half given up on you. Oh, my poor dear, you must be beside yourself with tiredness. Come along, come inside, I'll give you some tea right away. Would you like to wash up? The hot water's ready. Oh, and aren't you pretty? Everything you could have ever hoped for, isn't she, Will? To Alma's surprise, she heard the voice of her new husband, tinged with amusement. Yes, Ma, she's all that and more. But she's tired right now. I don't know that I could rightly hold her to her vows, for I'm not at all sure she knew what she was saying. Ah, well, said his mother, with another warm smile that Alma felt all the way down to her toes. We'll just find out in the morning, I suppose. Mrs. Allen, Alma gradually pieced together, was named Martha, and please do call me Martha, my dear, I'm not the sort to stand on ceremony. She was friendly and welcoming, gently teasing to her grown son. In the dim light of the fire and the oil lamp, Alma could not be sure of how old she might be. She must be in her 50s at the very least, but there was a hint of youth about her that belied the age and the silver in her hair. Regardless of the details, Alma was grateful to find herself wrapped in a cocoon of welcome. Martha's warmth, she thought, was rather a stark counterpoint to her son's aloofness, his perfunctory politeness, and her openness was a complete opposite to how difficult Alma found her new husband to read. Evidently, he had not inherited his personality from his mother. Somewhere in the blur of the evening, with Alma's tiredness overwhelming her, she was given food and hot tea, followed by a tub of hot water and a room of blessed quiet, and followed once more by a darkened bedroom with comfortable sheets where Alma could at last lie down and breathe easy. Perhaps she would have had dreams, fueled by the uncertainty of her new situation, but her mind was too exhausted for anything but sleep. As soon as her eyes closed, head on the pillow, she thought of nothing but the long, quiet velvet stretch of the night. Chapter 4. The sound of the chickens cackling outside her window awoke Alma out of a sound sleep. For a moment she remained where she was, utterly still, without even opening her eyes. Then the memory swept over her, and she sighed deeply, pushing aside the covers. It was late October. She had been in Roebuck for just over a week. She was a married woman, the wife of a ranch owner. And she still felt much more like Alma Weaver than she did like Mrs. William Allen. Sighing once more, she went about the business of getting ready for the day. As she washed at the basin of cold water in the corner, shivering as she did so, moving quickly to escape the cold into the warmth of the kitchen, she thought of Will Allen and what she had learned about him in the past week of being married to him. Precious little, at that. Though he was never less than courteous, he still had a marked tendency to keep his thoughts to himself. No matter what she said, he rarely if ever gave her his own opinion in return, and when she asked questions about the ranch, about his family, about the past, he was always quick to change the subject. Though they had been married for a week now, he was obviously holding her at arm's length, still aloof, still removed. Still guarded. What did he have to guard himself against? She wanted to cry aloud. She was there because he had invited her to be there. She bore his last name because he had chosen to marry her. Was her marriage only ever to be a relationship as distant as mere acquaintances? There was no point in moping over what she could not change, she told herself sternly, and decided that it was time to put her attention on the day ahead, rather than the myriad mysteries of William Allen. One thing she had begun to learn was his routine. He was always gone when she arose in the morning, no matter how early she got up. The door to his room at the far end of the hall was always closed. She was grateful that her momentary fear that he would insist on the traditional right of a husband to sleep beside his wife, had not come to fruition. He scarcely touched her, let alone anything more than that, and gave no indication that he had any inclination to do so. Well, apart from the moments, few and far between, when she discovered him watching her with that strange intensity in his gaze. That intensity that made her shiver a little, even just to think of it. But that meant nothing, she told herself. He wanted her as a wife simply to cook for him, that was all, though in reality, she knew she had no clear idea of what he wanted at all. He certainly hadn't stated his intentions or his hopes. Nor had he asked hers. He accepted what she did around the house and the yard without complaint or interruption. He was as much of a mystery after a week as he had been in the first 5 minutes upon their meeting. On her own, with input from Martha, she had set herself a little routine that seemed to take care of her chief responsibilities. There was always a fire blazing in the kitchen when she came down in the morning. Will must start it for her, a kindness for which she could not help but be grateful, especially on cold mornings like this. She would set the kettle on to boil, set out bread and butter to be toasted, collect the scraps from the meal the night before, and go out to feed the chickens. Though the rooster had intimidated her from the first day, she found that watching the hens run around the yard, scratching industriously for bugs and worms, was one of her chief joys throughout the day. They had such funny little personalities, and always seemed to be talking amongst themselves like a bunch of gossipy old ladies. Then came breakfast. Ideally, she knew, it would not take too long to prepare, but it seemed to vary from day to day. Some days she must fill the pot on the stove too full, and the water took forever to boil. Other days, she burnt the toast or the bacon or the oatmeal, sometimes all three. She'd never been a natural cook, and her experience with homemaking was extremely limited, as she had only ever lived in her mother's household or the home managed by her sister-in-law. The routine was simple enough, when it worked. Which, thus far, it never had. On this particular morning, the toast was smoking on its rack above the fire, licked by the edges of the flames, while she tried ineffectually to stir up the two cold coals in the oven into enough life to cook the sausage that waited in its pan. When Martha came bustling in through the kitchen door, Alma turned to her with something of a wail. "Oh, I'm so glad to see you. I simply cannot make things go smoothly today. What am I doing wrong?" Martha chuckled as she took the toast from its rack and replaced it with new slices of bread, then poked up the fire vigorously. It leapt into flames at once. "There you are, no harm done." Alma sank down into a chair at the table, rubbing her eyes with her fingertips. "That's easy enough for you to say," she said tiredly. "But I haven't even gotten the water to boil enough to make coffee, and meanwhile the toast is burnt to a crisp. I'll never get the hang of this." "Nonsense, my dear," said Martha cheerfully, setting the kettle on the hob and spooning coffee into the pot. "You've only been here a week. And Roebuck must be very different from New York City." "That is true," Alma agreed, thinking that it was also an understatement, and a vast one. "Do you really think that, with experience, I'll be anywhere near as accomplished as you are at running this household?" "I fear that I lack the necessary qualities." "Of course you will," Martha told her warmly, handing over a cup of coffee that, as far as Alma could tell, had appeared by magic. "And I'm certain you have many other good qualities, as well, which others most likely lack. Weren't you a governess, back east?" "I was," Alma said, smiling. "How did you know that?" "Oh, Will told me, of course." The thought made her catch her breath a little. The information that the matrimonial agency had sent to Will had been rather brief and perfunctory. The idea that he had shared it with his mother nonetheless was almost touching. Did he sit here with her and talk about the young woman who was headed his way? Did he dream of what she might be like, the way she had daydreamed about him as she sped southwest on the train? And the subsequent question, impossible to avoid, was he disappointed when she arrived, as she even now feared that he still was? She shook the thought away. It was unproductive, and goodness knew that she had far too much to do today to waste her time on thoughts like that. It wasn't as though William was going to confirm or deny, anyhow. Even if she had been able to get up the gumption to ask him. "It's very kind of you to say," she said. "I'm afraid that I do feel rather inadequate when it comes to life here in Texas. It is so very different. Why, every time that I walk outside and see the fields rolling away in front of me, I have to stop and pinch myself, Martha, just to prove that I'm not dreaming." Her mother-in-law chuckled, and Alma went on, curling her hands around the hot mug and looking into the black depths of the coffee. "If I could only feel that there was just one thing I could do well, to be the sort of wife that William wants me to be." Martha reached over and patted her hand. "You're exactly what Will wants," she said. "Don't you worry about that for a moment." It was on the tip of Alma's tongue to question why, then, her husband still seemed to be so removed, so distant from her, despite her best attempts. But of course, his mother would only think the best of him, and besides, Alma had seen how different Will could be with his beloved Ma, the only family member he had left, evidently. Would she ever find the courage to ask him what had happened to the wife he'd lost? He stayed away from the subject as though it pained him, and because she had no desire to cause him pain, she had not questioned him too deeply about his past. The longer she was there without speaking of it, the harder it would be to delve into it, she feared. "You're very kind," she murmured again. Her mother-in-law cocked an eye at her, as though she suspected that Alma did not entirely believe her. But the door to the kitchen was opening again now, a cold morning breeze blowing in along with William, and Alma turned her head to look at him as though she could not help herself. Despite the mystery of him, or perhaps because of it, there was something almost mesmerizing about William Allen. One day, she hoped, she would understand exactly why. He gave his mother a smile, quite warm, and another to Alma, more polite than warm, she felt, and it stung her a little as it always did. She was not, could not be, jealous of his relationship with his mother, the obvious affection he felt for her. It was only right. She had felt the same way about her own mother, about her brother and sister-in-law. But she couldn't help but crave a little of that warmth for herself, even as she despaired a little more each day of ever getting it. "Good morning, Mr. Allen." The words slipped out before she could control them, and she squeezed her eyes shut for a moment at her faux pas. "I mean, William." He chuckled. "One of these days, I reckon you'll get used to me, Alma," he said. She opened her eyes again, glad that he was reacting with amusement rather than irritation. It was far from the first time she had made the slip of the tongue over the past week. "I hope we will get used to each other," she murmured. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee and did not respond. His mother, glancing from Alma to her son, stood up and went to turn the bacon, which was bubbling away busily on the stove. "Will," she said, "I think you ought to teach Alma how to shoot." Both William and Alma turned their heads toward Martha simultaneously, and as one they both said, "What?" "It makes perfect sense to me," Martha went on, not seeming the least bit perturbed by their own perturbation. After all, your father taught me to shoot his rifle when we first came here to Roebuck. Of course, it was for squirrel hunting at the time, but all the same it was a skill I was glad to have." "You've never shot a squirrel in your life," William said, brow furrowed. His mother wheeled on him, her free hand on her hip, one eyebrow arching. In the moment, she looked remarkably like her son. "Is that so?" "As though I had no life before you were born, William Allen." She laughed, as much at herself as at him. "Anyway, I never said I was very good at it. But I reckon that Alma will be." William turned to eye her speculatively. Alma sat back in her chair, feeling as though she wanted to ward both the Allens off. A gun. She could not imagine learning how to shoot something that could cause damage to another creature. "Now, I don't know that," she started. "Why not?" Martha asked her. I don't believe I'd be very good at it either." "But you'll never know unless you try," her mother-in-law urged her. "After all, you were just telling me that you wished you felt there was something you could do well to help out here on the ranch." "But, shooting squirrels?" Martha laughed again. "Oh, that was just Henry's way of training me," she said. "You needn't shoot at anything living. Will can set you up with targets on hay bales, can't you, Will? It wouldn't be for hunting, anyhow." "Then what?" Martha looked meaningfully at her son, who caught his mother's glance and then looked away. "You ought to tell her, William," she said. "She belongs here now, she must know the truth at some point." "Why not now?" Alma's eyes fled back to William's. He looked up at her at last, heaving a sigh as though in acknowledgement of the truth of his mother's words. "All right," he said. "I reckon so, Ma. Alma, the prairie here can be a dangerous place to be. Maybe 10, 15 years ago we'd never have thought of teaching our women to shoot, but these days." She shook her head a little. "Wild animals, I suppose," she said. "I can understand that. But they only come out at night, don't they? If I promise to stay inside." "Not just wild animals," he said slowly. She stared at him, feeling alarm slowly rise in her chest. "What, then?" He smoothed his hands together, palm to palm, choosing his words with care. "Wild folk," he admitted. "Cattle rustlers, outlaw gangs, bank robbers and the like." He glanced swiftly up at his mother, who nodded at him. "I don't like to dwell on it, myself. But it's a fact, and there's no gettin' around the facts." There was a hesitation in his voice that told Alma that he wasn't telling her everything he had intended to. The faint expression of disappointment in Martha's eyes seemed to confirm it. But Will stood abruptly from the table before she could formulate the words of her question and reached for his coat once more. "I'd better get back out there and check on the cattle." "But Will, you haven't had breakfast yet," objected his mother. William glanced at her, then away, as dismissively as though she had not spoken. "Storm's comin'," he said, and then he was out the door, closing it carefully behind him to keep the heat from escaping. Alma turned to Martha, who pressed her lips together and shook her head even before Alma began to ask. "Why did he?" "No," said his mother, tightly. "He'll have to tell you, he'll have to explain it all. He won't want me to do it, and I reckon it won't help you any if I do." She caught sight of the expression on Alma's face and her own face softened. She reached out to put a hand on Alma's auburn curls. "Be patient with my son," she said. "Be more patient than I am, my dear, you are his wife, after all. I'm only his mother." She heaved another sigh. "He'll be back before long, I reckon. I'd better get on back to the cottage and fix my own breakfast. He's right, those clouds look like a storm, if I ever saw one." A kindly smile and then she was gone, leaving Alma alone in the kitchen with no noise beyond the crackling of the fireplace and the faint roaring in her ears as she tried to understand what had just occurred. More than ever, she was certain that her husband was keeping something secret from her. What could it be? Undoubtedly it had something to do with the dangers of the land around Roebuck, but where she had assumed that danger came from bears and wild cats, it was evident that he had something else in mind. Cattle rustlers? Outlaws and gangs? She well knew the danger of robberies. There had been plenty of those in New York, robberies of banks and stores and private homes. It was a crime that knew no boundaries. But the other dangers, and something else, something unspoken that she could not comprehend. He returned more swiftly than she anticipated, allowing her just enough time for her mind to build up too many possibilities for which there were no answers. Mr. Allen. He glanced up, raising one eyebrow at her, and she blushed hotly, amending the ejaculation. I'm sorry, William. Will, if it's any easier for you, Alma. Will, I was hoping you would come back. Distractedly, she set a plate of bacon and toast down in front of him. He picked up a fork but did not begin to eat. It seemed as though his mind was as far away from the situation as her own, distracted by his own thoughts. You're not upset with your mother? He glanced up at her and frowned. Of course not. Good, she only meant well, I know it. She paced in front of him, twining her fingers together. She obviously felt that there was something I ought to know about life here on the ranch. Will, I'm certain that you're keeping something from me. Won't you tell me what it is? For once, he was easy to read. She could tell by the deepening frown on his face what his answer would be well before he said it aloud. If I thought it would do you any good, Alma. Then you think it will harm me somehow, to know what your mother wanted me to know? I cannot believe that she would put me in danger, Will. Of course she wouldn't put you in danger, he said impatiently. That's not what I'm saying. What are you saying? You don't understand what it's like here, Alma. You don't understand how quickly life can change, one moment to the next. She spread her arms wide, feeling at a loss, frustration tinging her tone. How can I hope to understand, William Allen, if you won't explain it to me? He stood from his chair now, a scant few inches from her. She hadn't realized that she had come so close to him. When had that happened? Somewhere during their dialogue, which was growing hotter by the second, she had stepped up close to him, so that when he leaned down slightly, she was overcome with the certainty that he was going to snatch her up in his embrace. A flash of a vision fled across her mind, the thought of him leaning just a little closer and pressing his lips to hers. But of course, he did not. He straightened at once and took a step back. I'll teach you how to shoot, he said, turning his gaze away from hers. This afternoon. Come out to the barn. I'll teach you how to shoot, and that's all, Alma. That's all, for now. For now. She clung on to the words long after he had left, trying to sort out the myriad causes for her frustration and determine whether there was any satisfaction in the offing. If he would only promise to tell her the secret he was keeping from her, if she had any real hope that he would someday leave behind this quiet, distant persona and let her see the man he truly was within, then she would do just as Martha had asked. She would be patient, until he responded to her. She would be patient, and hope for that day when he might do just as she had imagined he would, and sweep her up into his arms, and let the walls between them fall to pieces at their feet. The shock ran over her like the feeling of lightning close by. She hadn't realized it until now, but the confusion of her feelings for Will was not just the product of her frustration with his standoffishness. It was not just wishing to know what lay beneath that polite exterior, that reluctance to express himself. It was far more than that, it was all that conflicted emotion, driven on and exacerbated by her attraction to him. She had thought him striking from the moment they had met, it was true, but she knew now that she found him far more than just that. Striking, intriguing, alluring, and maddening. She knew, suddenly and all at once, that she was in danger after all, the unexpected danger of falling in love with her husband. Chapter 5. Martha turned her head and smiled at Alma. I'm mighty glad you were ready and willing to come with me today, Alma. I'll be glad of your help with this long shopping list. Alma smiled back. It was almost impossible not to. Martha had a smile that made her eyes twinkle brightly, making her look as though she was little more than a girl. She couldn't help but wonder whether Will ever smiled in quite that bright a way. She had a feeling it would be devastating if he did. I'm mighty glad that you asked me, she said, teasing her mother-in-law a little with a faint mimicry of her accent. It's too beautiful a day to be cooped up inside. Indeed, it was the prettiest day she'd seen since she'd arrived in Texas. The heavy rainstorms of the past few days had dissipated at last, grumbling on their way west. They had left the bluest sky she'd ever seen in their wake. Perhaps it was so very blue because there was so much of it, Alma thought, lifting her gaze heavenward with a grateful smile. For the first time since her arrival, she did not feel put off by the vastness of the landscape around her. But she still felt a little lonely. It was pure pleasure to have Martha there beside her. Though she had ventured into town once or twice in the past 3 weeks, she had scarcely met anyone, and it had proven strangely difficult to retain any impressions of those she did meet. Even the young couple who had been witnesses at her wedding she'd had to be reintroduced to. The only one she recognized from that strange whirlwind of an event was the preacher, who had greeted her with a familiar joviality but who obviously hadn't the faintest idea who she was. Martha had proven to be a fast friend, and a good one. What would life on the ranch be like without her? It made Alma shudder a little to think of it. Why, she would have been completely alone, with only her growing affection for Will to sustain her, and as she was almost certain that it was entirely one-sided, it would have been poor sustenance indeed. Where are we going today? Well, let's see. Martha held the reins with one hand, reaching for her shopping list with the other. Then she paused, eyeing Alma. After a brief hesitation, she held the reins out to her. Do you mind? Alma hesitated in turn, but took them, nonetheless. Martha watched her closely. Just around the crook of your hand, there. Keep just a little slack. I guess you wouldn't have had much chance to drive a pair of horses and a cart. The briefest flash of lightning through her mind illuminated the dark afternoon and the driving rain of the storm she had gone through, only 3 weeks before. The horses tugging at the reins, rearing and screaming, before they finally gave into her desperate pulls and followed her to the middle of the muddy road. She shook her head. Not much call for it in New York. I didn't figure. Well, you'll have plenty of call for it here in Roebuck, and we'll be glad to help you learn anything you can use. She faced forward, glancing down at her list, but Alma caught the sardonic twist of her lip. No matter what Will has to say about it. Alma hesitated once more. The subject of Will's reluctance to tell her much about the dangers of the prairie, despite his agreement that she learn to shoot, was a delicate matter to question Martha about. Though the mother and son were as close as could be, they seemed to diverge in opinion on whatever secret Will held close to his heart, not letting Alma into the knowledge. If it were up to Martha, Alma suspected, she would have told her already. But it was evidently Will's decision to make, and Alma was loath to press Martha on it, asking her questions that she would not feel comfortable asking. Instead, she said, I'm gladder to learn to drive than I am to learn to shoot. Goodness, the kick the rifle makes when you pull the trigger. Martha's tension relaxed, and she chuckled. That first time, I half expected you to go flying backwards, she said. Of course, Will wouldn't have let you. He'd have caught you before you got too far. Alma's eyes drifted closed briefly, without her quite knowing it. His arm had been around her, steadying her, and when she had pulled the trigger, she'd rocked her weight back into him, but he hadn't moved. He was as solid as a mountain. Patient and quiet and kind, and a warm presence at her back against the chill in the autumn wind. We'll go to the mercantile first, Martha said decisively, oblivious to her daughter-in-law's daydreaming. Then the feed store, and then to the dressmaker's shop. I ought to do more of the mending and alterations myself, but time just seems to get away from me these days. I'll be glad to do what I can. You'll be busy, too, Alma. Running the ranch isn't easy. She sighed. When Henry was alive, I handled it all on my own. That was just what a rancher's wife did, and you'll find there are plenty of ranchers' wives around Roebuck, should you wish to ask for the benefit of experience. Once Will came back and took over, after his father died, he kindly took many of the responsibilities off my plate. Why, I haven't balanced a ledger for the past 5 years. I've never balanced one, myself. Ah, don't you worry, Martha said, reaching over to pat her on the shoulder. You'll be just fine. A bright young girl like you can handle anything the world throws at you. It's only when you get older that the simple things become a challenge. Besides, Will'll help you. He'll be there for you, anything you need. It was a kindly meant reassurance, but Alma couldn't help but wonder whether it was entirely true, or whether Martha could truly say it with such heartfelt conviction. After all, she didn't know. But perhaps she had seen the sort of husband that Will had been. The thought suddenly occurred to her. She didn't know when Will had been married, whether it was before he came back to the ranch or after. Nor did she know what occupation Will had held before returning to assume the responsibility of the ranch. She was curious, doggedly curious, but it never seemed to be the right time to ask the questions that teemed through her mind. And it wasn't the right time now, either. They rolled into Roebuck in the sunshine, and she had to put all her attention to driving the horses and cart carefully through the streets toward the mercantile. As they climbed down from the cart, an elderly man with a beard half as long as he was tall emerged from the shop, half skipping in his haste. He lifted his cane to wave in Martha's direction. "Hi, Martha." "Hey there." She glanced up, bemused. "Albert?" He began to hustle toward her. It was a rather alarming sight to see the old man, clearly doddering in his footsteps, trying to reach her with the news he bore. Martha glanced toward Alma swiftly, signaling her to follow, and then came quickly to the old fellow, grasping him by the arm to steady him. "Good morning, Albert, Alma, this is Mr. Albert Smith. He's the oldest resident of Roebuck, and he's known just about all of us since before we were born." Albert gave a slight chuckle, shaking his head. "Oh, I'm not so old as all that, Martha, but old enough to remember some things and smart enough to forget others." Martha smiled at him. "You're an example to us all, Albert. This is my daughter-in-law, Alma." Albert glanced at her, and Alma was taken aback by the keenness of the deep-set twinkling little eyes beneath the bushy brows. "Alma," he repeated ruminatively. "Married Will, did she?" "Yes. 3 weeks ago. Newlyweds." Albert sighed. "Why, I can remember the day when say, Martha, don't you try to distract me." He shook his cane at her again. Martha shook her head. "I'm not, I promise you." "You had something to tell me, Albert, what was it?" For a moment, his clouded eyes shone clear and serious. He gestured over his shoulder with the head of the cane. "Heard it in there," he said. "They're sayin' as it's old Jethro who's lead in the charge against the county. They're saying it's him who robbed the Hayward Bank last week, and Clemon's ranch, too." Alma fixed her gaze on Martha's, searching for some hint as to the significance of this. To her worry, she saw the older woman's face drain of color, suddenly looking her age, and then some. "Has anyone told Will of this?" Albert shook his head. "Just heard of it, just now. That's why I hastened out here soon as I saw you comin'. Tom says that the sheriff's been gone for 3 days over toward Black Rock, lookin' for Jethro, at least, lookin' to see whether it's Jethro or not. No one rightly knows, but you know what they say." His face was set and grim behind the beard. "No smoke without fire." Martha seemed frozen for a moment, but Alma sensed that her mind was working swiftly beneath the composure of her face. Suddenly she seized Alma's hand and turned her back to the cart. "We'd best get home right away and speak to Will," she said. "Thank you, Albert," she tossed over her shoulder. Alma, bemused, followed Martha's lead, climbing up into the driver's box at once. Of course, they hadn't achieved any of their aims in coming to town today, but it was obvious that this was far more important. Whatever it meant. "Martha," she said, as the older woman whistled the horses into movement, "who is Jethro? Why are you so afraid?" Martha shook her head, lips pressed together tightly. "I'm not afraid," she said. "It's Jethro Archer should be afraid, if he's back in the county. But, no, I can't imagine that he would, after all this time, after what happened before." She straightened up, nodding her head. "It must be just a rumor. It can't be true." But she urged the horses on a little faster, all the same. Alma bit back the questions that circled her tongue, hoping against hope that her mother-in-law would see fit to inform her of what she needed to know, and more than just what was necessary. Her imagination was running wild. Who was this Jethro Archer, and what did he mean to Martha and Will? Why must Will know about a simple rumor regarding his presence in the county? And why was the Allen family so very private and secretive that they could not allow Alma even the smallest hint as to what was going on? After all, it impacted her life, too. She pushed aside the spurt of selfishness and fixed her gaze on Martha, hoping that her concern would be obvious without needing to be stated aloud. Martha glanced over at her and heaved a sigh. "But in case it is," she said. "I suppose there's no harm in me telling you that Will used to be a Texas Ranger here in Jasper County. He joined up along with his father when he was just 18. Well, Henry stayed here to patrol the ranches for cattle rustlers, but Will was offered a position in Austin, and he took it. He was gone for years. I never knew what all happened while he rode with the Rangers, and I reckon it's just as well that he never told me, for a mother's heart is never free from worry at the best of times. It was while he was out there in Austin that he encountered Jethro Archer." She blew a breath out, seeming to be almost in disbelief over what she was saying. "He was the leader of the Muddy Creek gang at the time. Will busted him, broke up the gang, but Jethro escaped. Not being the sort of man who knew how to leave well enough alone, he set his sights on Will, I guess you could say. He's been plaguing him ever since." She shifted her weight on the seat, squaring her shoulders. "But we haven't heard hide nor hair from Jethro Archer in the past 8 years, ever since before Will came back to Roebuck. Since before his pa died." Was that what she had been going to say? There seemed to be more that Martha wasn't telling her, but Alma decided that she ought to be grateful even for this information. "If Jethro Archer is here in Roebuck once more," she said slowly, "then that can only mean that he's after Will." Martha shot her a glance, her brow creased with worry. "Ah, see, this is why Will was so reluctant to tell you about his history. It would worry any wife, same as it worries the mother. But don't you fret, Alma, it's just as likely to be a rumor. And even if it isn't, the sheriff is on the job." She lifted her chin, cheering herself with the reminder. "Yes, Sheriff Young is a hard-working lawman. He's been on the trail for 3 days," Albert said. "Rest assured that he'll take care of it all." Still, Alma could not shake the sense of foreboding that swept over her, even with her mother-in-law's reassuring words. The beauty of the day seemed tainted somehow, and even though the skies were no less blue than they had been an hour before, it felt as though there were some dark clouds on the horizon, invisible but looming all the same. Martha stopped the horses before the house and nodded Alma toward it. "You go on in, dear," she said. "I'll go and put the horses away and tell Will the news. I'll tell him the rumor." With one final reassuring smile, she urged Alma inside. Alma's heart was still pounding as she did as she was bid, her mind sorting through the possibilities that the new intelligence opened. If Will's history as a ranger was so dangerous that he had been reluctant to even tell his own mother, perhaps there was an indication of why he kept it so secret and close, and indeed why he was unwilling to tell his new wife about it, for fear of frightening her. After all, they had only known each other a short while. Might he someday have enough trust in her to tell her of his experiences? She could only hope, there was no way to be certain. She tried to busy herself in the kitchen, but her mind and heart were with Martha and Will in the barn. It was scarcely more than 10 minutes before she heard them approaching the kitchen door, which she had left open, and yet it felt like an hour. She watched them closely as they came in and saw that her fears were well-founded. Perhaps Martha was clinging to the hope that the notorious bandit was little more than a rumor, but from the set, grim look on Will's handsome face, she knew that he believed every word of what Albert had reported. His eyes flew to hers immediately, and she saw something in them that gave her hope of his truthfulness. He lifted his chin. "Well, Alma," he said. "I reckon you have a few questions for me." She turned from the stove, clasping her hands together, trying to control her eagerness. Would he unravel the secret at his heart all at once? It seemed too much to ask, too much to expect. And yet his mother, standing behind him, gave her a firm nod that suggested they had discussed the subject at length. "Yes, Will," she said. Or rather, she bit her lower lip. "Whatever you feel that you can tell me, Will, I would like to hear." He turned his gaze toward the window, nodding as he did so. But before he could speak, she heard the noise, too, the sound of hoofbeats approaching rapidly, a horse at full gallop. Will murmured something under his breath. It sounded terribly like a curse. He moved from the kitchen toward the door at just shy of a run, leaving his wife and mother to stare at each other with wide eyes. As one, they linked arms and followed him. He was already out on the front porch, and the rider was coming to a stop. The man on horseback tumbled off and stumbled his way to the stairs. Alma recognized him vaguely and realized that he was one of the witnesses at their wedding. John, his name was, she was sure, John Linnet, the local blacksmith. And, she realized, seeing the star pinned to his chest, also a local deputy. He came up the stairs breathing hard, as winded as though he himself had been running instead of the horse. Will stepped to meet him, gripping him by the shoulder and half-hauling him up to take a seat on the bench by the door. What news? His tone was as grim as his face, and Alma knew suddenly that he had some premonition of what he was about to hear. A rider from Black Rock. John Linnet hauled in a breath that fought him like a fish on the line. Young is dead, and 5 of his posse. Will sucked in his breath, and Martha let out an involuntary cry. John Linnet did not spare a glance for her, only fixing Will with his gaze and nodding. It's Archer, all right. Old Archer, back for revenge. Revenge. The word was cut in half as Will turned away from his friend, running a hand through his dark hair. He turned back after a moment, having regained control of himself. Once again, Alma was certain that there was more to the story than she had been told. More, perhaps, than she could ever hope to learn. Clements, the last deputy left, Linnet said, regaining his breath at last. And you know he's as old as the hills. He sent to ask you to step in, Will. He asked that you take over as sheriff. A hush settled over the little group on the veranda, a hush that was as tense as a shootout all on its own. Will did not meet anyone's gaze, though all 3 were staring directly at him. Instead, he turned away and faced the horizon, looking out over the vast rolling amber fields of his ranch, the home he had inherited from his father, the roof under which he had grown up, and the place where his mother and wife would wait for him, should he go out to the fight. Alma watched him as he rubbed his chin, silent and thoughtful. He would do it, she knew at once, without doubt. He would do it, regardless of whether she wanted him to or not. It would not make it any easier on him for her to urge him, but it might spare her own feelings a little. It might make her feel a bit brave. She stepped forward and put a hand on his arm. It was the first time in the 3 weeks they'd been married that she had done so. He turned to look down at her, his eyes unfathomable. Go, she said softly. You're needed, Will, go and do as you must. It was something of a triumph that he did not look to his mother for her urging. He kept her gaze for a long, silent moment, and at last he nodded. He lifted his head and turned back to Linnet. Black Rock is only a day's ride away, he said. The last spate of rustling came from Arnecker, another day beyond. There's no need for me to ride out to Black Rock in search of him. Jethro Archer and his gang are coming here. They're coming to Roebuck. His mouth was set and grave. They're coming for me. Chapter 6. For 3 days, Will Allen wore the silver star on his chest, and the world held its breath. For Alma, it was almost a form of torture. Of course, it would have been far worse if they had been attacked. She knew it in the depths of her heart and knew that she should be grateful for the reprieve, temporary as it might well be. But with every passing day, the tension seemed to stretch even more tightly, until she began to fear that if something, anything, didn't happen, she might well go crazy from the fear of it. Was it possible for a young woman to drive herself to lunacy simply from strain? She had half a mind to call on the local doctor and find out. Perhaps she would feel differently, even better, about things if Will would just open up to her once and for all. Though he had given her some information about his past at last, it was just enough to make her worry even more. What truly had happened between Will and Jethro Archer, that the man should be coming after him after all these years? Or was that simply a measure of the sort of man the outlaw was, the kind who was unwilling or unable to forget a grudge against a lawman? Will's past as a ranger was intriguing, if also a little frightening. Was it just the death of his father that had caused him to stop? It didn't seem to line up. He must have been a good lawman, for the town to come to him now without question and ask him to take on the mantle of sheriff in their time of need. It couldn't have been fear, could it? Was it Jethro Archer himself who had forced Will to return to Roebuck and take up a quiet life as a rancher? And through all her questions, the ghost of Will's unknown wife, with her mysterious fate, floated through like a mist. Someday, Alma promised herself, she would find out what had happened, but someday was not here yet. There was far too much at stake to risk straining her cautious new relationship with Will, or asking more of him than he was able to give. The news came on the third day. Another ranch had been hit on the far side of town. Will listened to the tale from John Linnett, who had hung up his hammer to serve as Will's deputy, and shook his head grimly. "Closer and closer," he said. "Will you ride out there?" Alma asked quietly. Will turned to her, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'd better," he said. "But I'll be back before dark." "They need you, Will." "There's no rush, don't worry about me and your mother." A faint frown crossed his striking features. "But I do," he said. "I don't know where Jethro Archer might be headed next, Alma, or if he's intending to draw me off just so he can pick on my own ranch." She shivered a little at the thought. "Tell me what to do, if he does," she said. "I know how to shoot, now, I can walk out with the dogs and scare him off." Another man might have smiled, taking her offer in the spirit of jest. She had only halfway meant it, after all. But Will's frown only deepened, and he shook his head swiftly. "You and Ma just stay inside the ranch house until I get back." "But I do know how to use the rifle." "Sure, you do, but I don't want you to." "I mean it, Alma. Stay in the house." His tone was sharp, sharper than she had ever heard. She pressed her lips together, wanting to argue the point further, to insist to him that she was more capable than he evidently thought. But Martha was standing just behind her, listening, and so she controlled herself and nodded. It was a long, quiet afternoon, with no noise outside except for the gusting of the frigid autumn wind. For the first time, Alma thought she tasted the bite of winter on the breeze and closed the kitchen windows against it. He was back, as he had promised, before dark, and the three had supper together. Martha waved away her son's offer that she stay in the spare room. "You know I sleep better in my own bed, Will. Everything will be just fine." She put a hand on Alma's head as she left, smiling down at her tiredly. "Get some rest, my dears." For a long while, Will sat quiet at the table, his hands clasped before him. Alma sat with him, unwilling to leave while he might yet have something to say to her. But at last, he looked up, and she knew that the moment for speech had passed. He had made up his mind yet again that he would not tell her what she so desperately wanted to know. But he offered her a smile, even more tired than his mother's. She had learned to read the spark in his eyes that was so much like Martha's, a dampened down sort of warmth, but a warmth, nonetheless. Would she ever feel it in his touch the way she now saw it in his gaze? Or would she spend the rest of her life just wanting, pining away for the knowledge of her husband's secrets? "It'll be an early morning tomorrow," he said. "I'd best get to bed now." "All right, Will." He hesitated, just a few feet away from her, half turned toward the door. "Alma." She looked up, eyes wide. "Yes, Will?" He sighed. "Thank you," he said at last. "For wanting to help." She shook her head a little, almost in disbelief. Of course I want to help, Will. This is my home, now. You and Martha are my family. You're my husband." She could not be certain, but there seemed to be a hint of sadness in his eyes as he nodded, accepting her words without questioning them. Then he was gone, leaving her once again wondering what words he himself might have said, had the trust between them been strong enough to bear them. The sound of a gunshot woke her from a deep sleep. She sat up in her bed, feeling muzzy and half awake. A second shot galvanized her into action, and she leapt from her bed, stopping only long enough to slip her dressing gown on before she raced for the stairs. He must have left his bed as soon as the first shot sounded. She heard him pounding down the stairs and toward the door. "Will." But he was gone, out the front door, without acknowledging her call. Perhaps he hadn't heard it at all. She hesitated for a moment, standing at the open door, staring out into what remained of the velvet night. Then another shot came, and a faint and far-off cry, and she shoved her feet into her boots without lacing them and ran into the darkness. Far ahead of her, she saw the bobbing of a lantern, headed for the barn. He must have been running swiftly. She spared a glance for the cottage and saw that there was an oil lamp lit in the window. Martha, too, had been awakened by the noise, of course. But she couldn't stop to consult with her. Will had already made the barn and then left again, bareback on a horse. She flung herself after him, sending a silent and hurried prayer of thanks to the heavens above for seeing to it that Will had taught her to ride even as he had taught her to shoot. She could saddle the horses, too, though it was difficult for her. She had no choice at the moment. She didn't know how to ride bareback, and she couldn't very well follow him on foot. Heart pounding, she struggled through the bare minimum of tact to ensure that Will's old white mare would do as she was told. Lady was docile, at least. Alma was grateful that Will had chosen to ride his gelding, though of course it only made sense. The gelding was younger and much faster, and Lady was bound to poke along at half the pace that Alma would have wanted. Still, she seemed to pick up on Alma's hurry and moved relatively quickly once they got going and the barn was left behind. She could no longer see the bobbing lantern that betokened Will and the gelding, but the sound of another shot and another cry, louder this time, gave her the direction she needed to go. It wasn't Will's own ranch that was being attacked. It was the neighbor's, not more than half a mile away. She lowered her head and held on tightly to Lady's reins, letting the old horse move as swiftly as she chose. More quickly than she would have thought possible, she heard the ruckus ahead of her. Shouts were exchanged, a few strange voices, and then that of her husband, and another shot. The dim light of the lantern flared suddenly, with an accompanying sound of breaking glass, and she realized with a cold certainty that it meant that Will had fallen, it meant that Will had been hurt. Without thinking, she let loose with a cry that echoed through the night like a banshee. The oil from the lamp had doused the grasses that it had fallen on, and a good-sized patch of the field was suddenly ablaze. In its light, she could make out 5 figures, one prone on the ground, one standing, the other 3 on horseback. For the first time, the shouts came through the roaring in her ears, carrying meaning at last. Maybe he wasn't lying. Maybe there is someone else comin'. I'm tellin' you, he was lying through his teeth. Jethro'll be furious if we get caught again. He'll be angrier still if we let Alan stay on the loose. I hear horses. Let's get out of here, boys, and sort it out tomorrow. Lady raced into the light of the fire just as the other 3 scattered, but Alma could not bring herself to chase after them. She had eyes only for the figure who lay on the ground. The other one who was still left was beating at the flames with his jacket and proved to be the owner of the neighboring ranch. Alma spared him hardly a glance before she was on her knees beside her prone husband. Will. He groaned as he sat up, clutching his head with one hand, the other arm dangled at his side. She sucked in a breath. Will, you're hurt. He began to struggle to his feet, and she slipped his arm around her shoulders. Though he was clearly reluctant to do so, he leaned on her as he stood. In the firelight, his devilish eyebrows were sharp and black, drawn downwards over the bridge of his nose in a mighty frown. Alma, what on earth are you doing here? I came after you. I wanted to help. Help by doing what? He shook his head and broke a curse word off under his breath. We'll talk at home. Charles. Letting his arm drop from her shoulder, he moved toward the neighbor rancher, stomping out flames in the grass as he went. Alma, feeling the cold of the night suddenly, joined them on the other side, doing as Will did. It was strangely satisfying to stomp down the flames, to stop them from licking at the golden grasses. Between the 3 of them, they got the last of the fire out before it had a chance to become a conflagration. By that time, there was a gray look to the skies that betokened the dawn. Will's sleeve was bloody. He winced as he drew it up to pull the cloth away from the skin. Charles nodded at it. You'd better get that seen to. Will shook his head. It's just a graze, that's all. Listen, Charles, they didn't get away with the cattle, so there's no harm done, is there? I don't want any talk about this in town. Roebuck's had a hard enough time, and every attack just makes the spirit that much more defeated. We need to pull together, we need courage. And I don't reckon that a midnight raid on the neighboring ranch to the sheriff will help that cause much. In the dim light of morning, Charles nodded, though he was clearly not entirely happy with the suggestion. Will nodded back. Good man. And keep an eye out for my horse, will you? They scared him so bad I reckon he won't stop running for a while, but if he doesn't find his way back to the barn he'll come back here looking for me. All right, Will. I'll watch for him. Will clasped him on the shoulder with his good hand, nodding his thanks. Alma stepped up toward him, hesitantly. Lady is still here, she said. Will you ride her home, Will? He eyed her for a moment, then glanced over his shoulder. Charles was on his way back to his own home, shaking his head as he went. Will looked back at Alma and sighed. She's a tough old mare, he said. She'll carry us both. Despite his wounded arm, he helped her astride the mare and leapt up behind her with as much agility as though he had not been up all night fighting with bandits. One arm went around her waist, reaching for the reins. She handed them over, trying to swallow past the lump in her throat and ignore the fluttering in her stomach at his closeness. Looks like you're a captive audience, he said. Reckon we might as well have it out here and now. She wanted, so badly, to turn and look into his eyes, to see what was hidden beneath that measured tone. But Lady was taking them home at a quick trot, and she had to hold tightly to the pommel of the saddle in order not to slip sideways. What do you mean? I mean you following me into the night, without a lamp or anything to defend yourself, not knowing what was awaiting you. His tone was sharp enough that it stung. You didn't know what awaited you, either, she managed. I'm the sheriff, Alma, you're the sheriff's wife. There's a difference. But, what do you think I ought to have done? Simply let you go off on your own without anyone to help? Sounds about right. It sounds entirely wrong. I've told you, Will, I want to help. You're my husband, this is my home. If you're going to tell me that a woman's place is in the home, while her husband is off putting his life in danger for reasons she doesn't even understand. Alma. This is the life you chose. I didn't force you to come here and marry me, no one did. And if you're sorry about it, well, you've got nobody to blame but yourself. His veneer of control was ragged now. He pulled Lady to a stop. Alma hadn't even realized how close they were to the barn, and slid from her back, reaching up to lift Alma down after him, despite his wounded arm. She landed on her feet with a solid thump, staring up at him. He looked right back down, and she couldn't help but wonder if her own frown was as black as his. I'm tougher than you know, she said. Tougher than you'll ever know, for you won't bother to try and find out. I can handle anything that is thrown at me, Will, by you or this ranch or the outlaws and bandits, but I'm fighting a battle without knowing why, and half the time I'm not even certain that you're on my side. Goodness, I don't even know which side I'm on. Palms flat, she reached up and gave him a push on the chest. He fell back a half step, no more, and for the first time his eyes lit with a candlelight spark. It sent a dart of fear through her. Was it anger that she saw? Was it fury? Had she gone too far? Oh, she had known that she couldn't push him until he was ready, until it was the right time. And yet, the words were out, and there was no taking them back. He lifted a hand and cupped her cheek gently. You're right, he said. Of course you're right. How could you know? Nobody has told you. He seemed to be speaking to himself far more than to her. He bit his lip, hesitating, and she held her breath. The warmth of his touch was a force she could feel all through her, right down to her toes. There's danger here in Roebuck, Alma. But it isn't just the danger of being a rancher's wife. It's the danger of being my wife, of being Mrs. William Allen. Her eyes found his, and she knew that her confusion must be reflected in them. He took a deep, ragged breath, and closed his eyes as he spoke. I came back to the ranch because I couldn't be a ranger, not anymore, not after Jethro Archer got free from the jailhouse just long enough to, everyone figured he was coming after me. I decided to come back to Roebuck for a week, to draw him off. But it wasn't me he came after. Alma's heart clenched like a cold fist. When I got back home, it was to find that he had shot Melissa, the name broke in half in his mouth, the second and third syllable little more than a whistle. She died alone, because of me, because I thought I understood the dangers, and because I thought she did, too. She was expecting. No one knew it yet, not even Ma. We were going to keep it a surprise. Alma reached up to put her hand over his, willing him to open his eyes and see her standing there, willing him to understand that her heart was with him. "Oh, Will," she breathed. She wanted desperately to put her arms around him, to comfort him however she could against the pain of the memory. But his touch on hers was still light and careful, as though he was not yet ready for anything more. She bit her lip, waiting for him to look at her. And at last, he did. He took in a long deep breath. "You see why I didn't want to tell you," he said. "It's frightening enough to leave your home behind and come all the way out here, without that weight on you, too. If I ever thought I'd hear the name Jethro Archer again, I'd never have asked you to marry me." "You didn't know," she said softly. "You couldn't have known." "No, but I should have waited until I knew he was dead, that's all. I should have known that no jail cell could hold him, no matter how many times I caught him." He turned his head away, dropping his hand from her cheek. "That's my fault, and none of yours. I should have been honest with you from the beginning, and let you decide when you knew the facts. It was dishonest of me to bind you to me with marriage when this could be possible." If she didn't ask her questions now, she knew, she might never have the gumption to do so again. "Why did you ask me to marry you?" she asked quietly. "You must have loved your wife dearly, why write to the matrimonial agency?" His face was still turned away from hers. "I reckon every man in the world is subject to some loneliness, at some point in his life," he said. "I did love Mel, I did love her. Reckon I still do. Some days I wake up and it's as though she's just in the other room, putting on the coffee." He closed his eyes briefly, and Alma found herself doing the same. Was this a jolt of jealousy that she was feeling in her chest? For shame. And over a dead woman, too, a woman who had the prior claim to Will's heart. "I'll always hold on to my memory of her," he went on at last. "But it's as much guilt as it is anything else, and guilt doesn't talk nice through the long winter evenings the way a pleasant companion does. I decided to marry again because I thought it was time. I thought I could move past the pain of losing her." Alma could hardly bring herself to breathe, scared of breaking the spell between them. "Can you?" she whispered. "Ever?" His eyes found hers again, and she saw the troubled pain within them. "I don't know," he said finally. She knew in her heart that this was the God's truth, that he feared that his confidence in himself had been misplaced, and that he had doomed them both to a marriage without any hope of love. She ached to tell him the truth in return, that she loved him more than she loved life, but there had been enough truth and blood spilled already that night, and she could not add to the damage. Quietly, she took his good arm and led him toward the house. "I'd best bandage up that arm, if you won't see the doctor," she said. "After all, you've got a long day ahead." She could feel his gaze on her as they went, silent and wondering. But she did not look back at him, not then. She kept her head forward, hoping vainly for some glimpse of what lay ahead. Chapter 7. "I don't like this plan much," said John Linnet, his brow furrowed and worried above his steel-rimmed spectacles. "I don't like it at all," Martha Allen declared, but no one bothered to ask me. Her son gave her a quick half-smile, rueful and tender. "It's not the best plan I've ever come up with," he admitted, "but it's the plan we've got. We can't just sit here and wait for Archer to keep picking off our ranches one by one. I know why he's here, he's aiming to get at me, if he can. Or anyone I care about." Was it born of her longing and imagination, that she thought she saw him glance swiftly in her direction? Or did he really think of her when speaking of who he cared about? Alma shifted in her chair, feeling warmed from the inside. After their conversation earlier that morning, he had been different toward her. It felt as though a corner had been turned and a whole new vista had opened in front of her. Perhaps, she prayed, the keeping of secrets was over and done with. "Now," he said, "I'm relying on you, John, to start spreading the word. We'll need as many volunteers as we can get to find Archer and his gang. Make sure they know that they're not to engage in a fight with him, just to send word and keep an eye on him." John Linnet nodded unhappily. "I guess there's not much choice," he said. I reckon Roebuck was hopin' to avoid havin' to go after Jethro Archer. I reckon so, too, Will said gravely. I know I was. Lynette sighed and went on his way, leaving Will behind with Alma and Martha. He glanced at his mother. Maybe we ought to put a pot of coffee on, Ma, we've got a long day ahead of us. She nodded. 2 pots, at the very least, she said, and bustled off toward the kitchen, muttering to herself under her breath. Alma turned back to Will to see that he wore a faint, fond smile very similar to the one she wore herself. I really do adore Martha, she said. She's been so kind to me ever since I arrived, and there's no one quite like her for spunk. Oh, I don't know, I figure you come close. 2 peas in a pod, you girls. He leaned back, folding his arms and smiling at her. I've a question for you, Alma, if you're ready to answer it. She felt a little thrill run through her. Yes, they had gotten past the secrets and the keeping things to themselves. If he felt comfortable enough to ask her a question, then she had the right to ask him in return. It was as though he had opened a door and invited her through. Anything, she promised. I've told you how I came to write to the agency back east, hoping to find a woman who wouldn't see me as the tragedy that everyone in Roebuck knows. But you, Alma, how on earth did you end up becoming a mail-order bride? A girl as smart and pretty as you shouldn't have had any trouble finding a place closer to home. She lowered her gaze to her fingers, twined around themselves. I was a governess, she said slowly. I loved my work. I saw 3 families of children into their young adulthood and had to move on each time. But one man decided that he wanted more than my services for the children. Hesitantly, struggling to find the right words, she explained the history with Jacob Herring, the gossip that had been spread around, and the final devastating rejection by the Alcotts. Will listened with seriousness in his face, frowning more and more deeply. When she had finished, he blew out a breath and shook his head. And that's how you came to find your way here, he said. No wonder you told me you were tougher than I knew. She couldn't help but half smile at that. It's all right, she said, thinking of the momentous events that had filled her journey by stagecoach, the storm soaking her through, the horses tossing and rearing, the shouts of fear from the passengers. I suppose I turned out to be tougher than I knew, too. No one ought to have ever treated you that way. No one ought to be treated that way at all, no matter who they are. Yes, I agree. But what's done is done. There's no going back now. Guess not, he said softly. And, I guess if not for all of that, you wouldn't be here. She met his gaze. I suppose I wouldn't. There appeared a faint smile, but genuine, and the warmth was back in his eyes. They twinkled brightly as his mother's, making him look far younger than he was, as though he was transported back to a time before any tragedy had befallen him. Alma was suddenly very grateful to be sitting down, for she felt rather weak in the knees. It's a rare cloud that has no silver lining, he said. I'm glad you're here, Alma. She couldn't help but return his smile. I'm glad, too. He stood from his seat as the noise of the first arrivals filtered through from the hall. The smell of coffee perfumed the air along with the rich, sweet smell of the autumn breeze. It had warmed up again that day, but Alma knew that the days were numbered before winter set in. They would have to make the most of them while they could. A governess, eh? Will said quietly, just before he turned out to meet his men. You liked working with children? She met his gaze steadily. I loved it. And did you want to have some children of your own, someday? Her heart leapt in her chest. Yes, she managed. Will nodded and took a long deep breath. Well, he said, I reckon we'll have to see what we can do about that. His plan was simple enough, even if nobody really cared much for it. Just about every man in town had been roused by John Lynette and volunteered to join the search. They were directed to move out in pairs, covering the area all around Will's ranch. After all, as he explained, Jethro Archer had been moving closer and closer, and was sure to be waiting his chance to strike directly at Will's heart and soul. When he was found, one man of the pair should stay and keep watch while the other returned to the ranch house and brought Will in. He never had a very big gang, he explained. It's easier to strike and get away with a small group. So, I don't anticipate that we'll have much trouble bringing him in once we find him. I'll wait here and gather up anyone I can to ride out with once he's located." He nodded to John Linnet, who signaled to the men and led them out. Will turned to his mother. "Any of that coffee left? It's a waiting game from here on out, and it's bound to take some time. I've put another pot on the stove." The men went through all I had. "Will, promise me one thing, won't you?" "Sure, Ma. That you won't go after Jethro on your own." She clutched at his sleeve, staring up at him with wide eyes. Alma held her breath. It was the very promise that she had longed to elicit from Will, but how much better, how much more meaningful, that it should come through his mother, whom he loved so dearly. Will eyed her for a long moment, and then sighed and nodded. "I promise, Ma." Satisfied, Martha trotted back to the kitchen, head held high in triumph. But Will would not meet Alma's eyes, and she knew that going on his own was exactly what he had planned to do, regardless of the men he'd called to help in the hunt. After all, he was the experienced lawman, the rest of them were simply volunteers, ranchers who were more afraid of losing their own stock than anything else. It was sheer self-preservation that drove them. It was justice that drove Will. She shook her head at him. "I do believe," she said, "that I'll never stop finding out more about you, William Allen." He glanced at her only briefly, but there was warmth in his smile. "I'd hate for you to get bored, Alma." "Oh, I think there is little danger of that." The next hours crawled by, just as Alma had feared it would. The day was rapidly coming to an end. If the night descended on them without Jethro and his gang being located, they were almost certain to attack again, and this time it might be disastrous. Alma closed her eyes and prayed as the sun hovered ever closer to the horizon. Her mind flashed back through all the times that had demanded her courage in the past few months, from turning down Jacob Herring Flat, to the endless search for employment, to getting on the train in New York and leaving her home behind, to the day that she had helped to keep the stagecoach from rolling over in the storm, and now here she was, faced with the chance of losing the man she was so deeply in love with, and she knew that all the courage she had mustered before was as nothing compared to what she needed now. She heard the shouting and knew without understanding the words that it meant the time was upon them. It was a man she didn't know who burst into the room. He was middle-aged and portly, puffing as though he'd run a 5-mile race. "Where are they?" Will was on his feet at once, his cup of coffee forgotten at his elbow. The man pointed out the kitchen window. "Eastern Meadow," he panted. "In the stand of oaks." Will clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Tom. Sit down and catch your breath. I'll follow you when I can. I'm sure of it." Will reached for the rifle that waited beside the door and then hesitated. His left arm was still bandaged and sore from the bullet that had scored it less than 24 hours before. He buckled on his pistols instead, reaching into the leather bag at his hip to ensure that he had ammunition. A swift glance at Alma, his eyes wide and open, meeting hers with a desperation unlike anything she had seen from him before, and he headed for the door. Alma felt a panic rise in her throat and she lurched after him. William Allen. I'll be back as soon as I can, don't worry." She clenched her jaw and snatched up the rifle, racing after him. "I'm going with you." "What?" He turned back, shaking his head immediately. "No, you're not, go back in." "Will, you promised your mother." She caught her breath. "I'm your wife, Will, and I'm stronger than you think I am. I know I can do this. You're the one who taught me to shoot, aren't you?" She blinked through unexpected tears, gazing up at him. "Let me do this, Will." "Why?" he asked softly, and she found the courage she needed. "Because I love you." It seemed as though time stood still. His fingertips ghosted over the lock of hair that had come loose to frame her face, and she was certain, for one blinding moment, that he would take her in his arms and kiss her. But then the moment was gone, over and done with, and he gave a faintly pained sigh. "All right," he said. "Because I promised Ma. And because you're tougher than I think, tougher than me, I reckon. But we're doing this my way, Alma, so you'll do exactly as I say." He stood back for a minute and looked at her. If I had a tin star, I'd put it on your chest and call you a deputy. But I don't have a tin star. She went up on her tiptoes, the rifle between them, and pressed a kiss to his cheek. That'll have to do, she said. He lifted her on the back of his gelding, who had returned to the barn earlier that morning, and got up behind her with a grunt of pain. She knew without asking that his arm was still throbbing. Healing would take time, far more time than he had. Once more, his arm was around her, his form solid and warm at her back, and she held on for dear life as they galloped across the prairie that she had come to call home. He pulled the reins to a stop and whispered in her ear. We'll stop here. Reckon if we come any closer, they'll hear us. I'll go first. John ought to be waiting for us not too far away. Stay beside him until I need you. She nodded breathlessly and let him help her to the ground. It was a physical pain to let his arms slip away from her waist, fearing as she did that she would never feel his warmth again, but time was of the essence, and she knew that she could not waste it in lingering beside him. It was enough that his hands slipped through hers as they made their way cautiously toward the little den of oaks. She would have stepped on Lynette herself, if Will hadn't been before her. He dropped to the ground beside his deputy, pulling her down along with him. She tried to follow the signs that the two men made back and forth, but their motions were too quick for her to comprehend. After a moment, Will nodded and turned to her. Stay here, he mouthed. She bit her lip, fighting against the urge to argue with him, and nodded. It was a heartbreak feeling, to watch him crawl cautiously off toward the dim sound of conversation, hushed and echoic in the silence of the shady oaks. The gang's hiding place was well chosen. She glanced over to John Lynette, but his eyes were on Will, and he did not look at her. It seemed that it was the waiting game yet again. She held her breath, counting seconds in the silence. Then suddenly behind them there came the sound of a branch snapping, and a loud breath puffing. John Lynette leapt to his feet with a curse muttered so low that she could scarcely hear it and hastened in the direction of the noise. It must be Tom, his partner, she realized, finally catching up with them. But the noise he was making would almost certainly alert the gang, and it had. Shouts from ahead. Shouts from behind. Her beloved's voice, strong and clear. Jethro Archer, put your hands up. I'm arresting you in the name of the law. More shots, and a yell. Her heart clenched within her, and before she was quite aware of it, she was on her feet, moving swiftly and silently toward the clearing where her husband was surrounded by the enemy. He had dodged behind a trunk, bullets pinging and whining around him. She only knew he was there because the firepower of the gang was concentrated on that single tree. As she watched, he appeared for no more than a split second, pistol in hand, squeezing off a shot toward the man who stood at the forefront of the rest, howling curses at the skies, and at the name of William Allen. She knew at once that this must be Jethro Allen. He stood with his back to her, a broad-shouldered man, hatless, his hair white as smoke. She knew without knowing that his eyes would be cold, if he turned to look at her. He was the man who had killed Will's first wife, and his unborn child, and God only knew how many others. He was the villain, the man that Will had sworn to bring to justice. But justice had taken refuge behind a tree. She knew that she should wait for the rest of the men to arrive to take charge, but she could not. Not while she had the means of salvation in her own hands. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she could disregard that. She had to. Holding her breath, she lifted the rifle until she could sight along the barrel. She ought to aim for his leg, she thought dimly, as though her mind was very far away from the rest of her. But would that be enough to stop the battle before Will was hurt? No, it was best to be certain. She would aim for. She let her breath out in a long, slow sigh, and squeezed the trigger. Jethro Archer let out a squeal like a pig and dropped to the ground. Almost simultaneously, the rest of the men came flooding into the clearing, all of them, every single man who had answered the call to search for the outlaw, ranchers all. The fight went on, but Alma knew that it was over, truly over. Jethro Archer turned and moaned on the ground, and the bullets had stopped entirely. As the good men of Roebuck captured the remaining members of the gang, Will stepped out from behind the tree, looking as though he had been transported there through no doing of his own. His eyes found her as she stepped forward into the clearing, and she wanted desperately to give him a smile, but all she could manage was to look again at Jethro Archer. He was not dead. Dead men didn't move and scream like that. Shaking harder now, she joined Will to stand above him. "Good shot," Will murmured. "Right through the thigh. I meant to shoot him in the back." "Oh. Only because I thought nothing else would stop him. And I was so afraid for you, Will, I guess." She bit her lip. "I'm glad enough to be wrong." This stopped him. Jethro turned a sweat-slicked face up to her, blinking in the shadows cast by the setting sun and the covering trees. "Who are you?" he demanded. Alma shook her head. "It doesn't matter who I am," she said. "That wasn't for me." She looked again to Will. "That was for Melissa." Will's eyes were flooded with the same tears that Alma had cried earlier that day, but now, in the heat of it all, she found herself calm and collected. But when he took her in his arms, she let herself be comforted even so. "Alma," he whispered. She drew back a little and looked up at him. For a long time, their eyes met and held and said the things that they had no words to express. At last, he cupped a hand at her cheek and pressed a kiss to her lips, as she had so often longed for him to do. He pressed his forehead against hers. "I'd ask you to marry me," he said quietly, "but I reckon that ship's already sailed." A small laugh burst from her, against her will. She realized suddenly how ludicrous it all was, her husband speaking to her of engagement, as they stood amid the turmoil that accompanied the apprehension of the gang, with his mortal enemy lying at their feet. And yet, she knew at the same time that she wouldn't have traded a single detail for anything else. Not for a life in New York, as a governess. Not for an easy life here in Roebuck, with someone who she didn't love as passionately as she did Will. Not for anything. He had asked her questions, and it gave her the right, in turn, to ask him. She took a deep breath and held on to her courage with both hands. "Do you love me, William Allen?" "Reckon I do," said her husband, with a smile. "Reckon I always will." The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susanna Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susanna Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susanna Calloway Western romance.